Power isn't about money. It's about the exact moment someone realizes they can crush you and chooses to do it just because you're standing in their eye line. Victoria Croft was a billionaire who treated human beings like scuff marks on a marble floor. Jason was just a tired father holding his son's hand, asking for the money he was owed. He didn't want to burn her empire to the ground. He just wanted a basic apology. When she laughed instead, she signed her own professional death warrant. Concrete and tempered glass absorbed all the warmth in the Croft Industries lobby, leaving behind an atmosphere that felt chemically sterilized. Jason stood near the reception desk, shifting his weight from one worn boot to the other. His joints ached. A dull, rhythmic throb pulsed behind his left eye, a souvenir from 3 consecutive all-nighters, pulling copper wiring and auditing server racks on the building's 52nd floor. Beside him, 7-year-old Leo clung to his father's pant leg. The boy's corduroy jacket was a size too small, the cuffs riding up past his fragile wrists. He was holding a plastic cup of complimentary water he'd managed to pry from the dispenser near the restrooms. "Just a few more minutes, buddy," Jason murmured, keeping his voice low so it wouldn't bounce off the cavernous ceiling. His palms were sweating. He needed this vendor check today. The rent was 8 days past due, and the late notices had escalated from polite yellow envelopes to threatening pink ones. The air pressure in the lobby abruptly shifted. The heavy revolving doors at the entrance hissed, spitting a group of people into the hushed space. Victoria Croft didn't walk. She marched, flanked by 3 identical men in charcoal suits, who seemed to exist solely to catch the expensive oxygen she exhaled. She wore a tailored ivory blazer that looked sharp enough to draw blood. The scent of her, a sharp, metallic blend of ozone and bergamot, cut through the stagnant lobby air before she even reached the center of the room. She was on her phone, voice clipped, eyes dead. Jason pulled Leo slightly closer, instinctively recognizing a predator moving through its territory. But Leo, exhausted and bored, shifted his weight backward. His foot caught the heavy base of a chrome stanchion. The plastic cup slipped. It hit the polished Italian marble with a pathetic, hollow thwack. The water splashed outward, a tiny tidal wave that surged directly across the path of Victoria's $1,000 suede stilettos. 3 drops. That was all that hit the toe of her shoe. 3 dark, mocking spots of moisture. Victoria froze. The phalanx of men in suits halted instantly behind her. A multi-car pileup of expensive wool. The lobby fell violently silent. The ambient hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded like a jet engine. She slowly lowered her phone. Her eyes, the color of wet slate, tracked down to her shoe, then across the puddle, stopping on Leo. The boy shrank, burying his face in Jason's thigh. "I am so sorry," Jason said instantly, the apology reflexive, frantic. He dropped to one knee, pulling a crumpled cotton handkerchief from his back pocket. "He just tripped. I'll dry it. I'm sorry." Victoria didn't look at Jason. She kept her gaze locked on the trembling boy. "Whose trash is this?" she asked. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It possessed the terrifying, quiet resonance of absolute authority. Jason's hand stopped mid-wipe. The blood rushed to his ears, a roaring static. "He's my son. We're just waiting on a payment from accounts payable. I was the server contractor for—" "I don't care what you are," Victoria interrupted, finally tilting her chin down to look at Jason. She took in the sawdust on his boots, the frayed collar of his flannel, the cheap haircut. Her lip curled, a microscopic adjustment that communicated volumes. "You brought a filthy child into my building, let him damage my property, and now you are kneeling in a puddle of tap water like a stray dog begging for a scrap. It was an accident. Jason kept his voice level, though his throat felt packed with sand. He stood up, deliberately placing his body between Victoria and his son. There's no need to speak to a child that way, or to me. One of the suits stepped forward, but Victoria held up a manicured hand, with rings that caught the fluorescent light like shards of ice. No need, she echoed, a hollow laugh scraping the back of her throat. She stepped closer. The bergamot scent was suffocating. You are an independent contractor, yes? Which means you are utterly disposable. You are a rounding error on my quarterly reports, and you have the audacity to demand respect while standing in my lobby, dripping water onto floors that cost more than you will earn in your miserable, pathetic lifetime. Jason swallowed hard. He needed the check. The pink envelope on his kitchen counter flashed in his mind. He forced the anger down, burying it under a mountain of desperate pragmatism. Ms. Croft, I apologize for the inconvenience. We will leave as soon as— You'll leave now, she stated. She turned to the nearest suit. Cancel his invoice. Whatever he's owed, route it to legal as a penalty for property damage. If he tries to sue, bury him in paperwork until he starves. Jason's chest tightened, panic seizing his lungs. You can't do that. I did the work. I installed your entire upper floor network. That's $10,000. It's nothing, Victoria corrected softly. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. It's nothing, just like you. Next time you want to play at being a father, try being a man who can actually afford to raise a son, instead of dragging him through the dirt to beg for my change. She didn't wait for a response. She stepped neatly around the puddle, her heels clicking a sharp, staccato rhythm on the marble as she headed for the private elevators. Jason stood frozen. He could feel the eyes of the receptionist, the security guards, the passing executives. Pity, disgust, second-hand embarrassment. It burned. It burned like acid poured directly onto his skin. He looked down. Leo was crying silently, fat tears leaving clean tracks through the faint smudge of dirt on his cheeks. I'm sorry, Dad, Leo whispered, his voice cracking. Jason knelt, pulling the boy into a tight embrace. His hands were shaking so hard he had to grip the fabric of Leo's jacket to hide it. Don't be sorry, Leo, Jason said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all its previous warmth. You didn't do anything wrong. As he carried his son out through the revolving doors into the harsh afternoon glare, Jason didn't look back. The desperate need for the $10,000 was gone, evaporated, and replaced by a cold, leaden certainty settling deep in his gut. The drive home was an exercise in agonizing restraint. Jason's rusted 2011 sedan rattled over the potholes of the industrial district, the suspension groaning in sympathy with the tight, coiled knot in his jaw. The car smelled like stale coffee and the pine tree air freshener that had lost its scent 3 years ago. In the passenger seat, Leo was asleep, his head resting against the vibration of the window. The boy's breathing was shallow, hitched with the residual ghosts of his crying. Jason's grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled. He felt sick. It wasn't the loss of the money, though that was a catastrophic blow. It was the absolute, crushing helplessness. Victoria Croft hadn't just insulted him. She had expertly diagnosed his deepest insecurity, his fear of failing his son, and weaponized it for sport. She had done it effortlessly. She had likely forgotten his face before the elevator doors even closed. He parked in the cracked asphalt lot of their apartment complex. The yellow glow of a dying street lamp cast long, bruised shadows across the dashboard. Jason turned off the ignition. The silence of the car felt heavy, suffocating. He rested his forehead against the cheap plastic of the steering wheel, closing his eyes. Try being a man who can actually afford to raise a son." The words echoed, bouncing around his skull like shrapnel. He carried Leo upstairs, careful not to wake him, laying the boy down on the twin bed with the faded superhero sheets. Jason stood in the doorway of the tiny bedroom for a long time, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of his son's breathing. Then he walked into the cramped kitchen. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. The only illumination came from the glowing green digits of the microwave clock. Jason opened his laptop at the small, wobbly dining table. He was a systems architect. Before his wife got sick, before the medical bills swallowed their savings whole, he had been a senior engineer at a major firm. He knew how networks breathed. He knew how data flowed, where it bottlenecked, and, most importantly, where the rot collected. Victoria Croft thought he was just a guy pulling cables. She didn't know he was the one who had mapped the entire digital nervous system of her new corporate headquarters. He had integrated their legacy servers with the new cloud infrastructure. He had seen the raw, unencrypted underbelly of Croft Industries. Jason wasn't a hacker. He didn't write malicious code or launch brute force attacks. He was an auditor. His superpower was finding the things people tried to hide in the mundane architecture of boring spreadsheets and forgotten subdirectories. When you rush an integration project, you leave doors unlocked. Not because you're stupid, but because you're lazy. And Croft's IT director, pressured by Victoria's insane deadlines, had been incredibly lazy. Jason opened a terminal window. The black screen reflected in his tired, bloodshot eyes. His fingers hovered over the keys. If he did this, it was a felony. If he got caught, Leo would go into the system. The stakes were absolute. He closed his eyes, trying to summon a reason to walk away. He tried to think of taking the high road, of turning the other cheek, of focusing on finding a new contract tomorrow. But then he remembered the texture of the marble beneath his knee, the smell of bergamot, the mocking, hollow sound of her laugh. He opened his eyes. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical focus. He typed in a string of IP addresses he had memorized weeks ago, a backdoor he had flagged for the IT department, a vulnerability he had told them to patch. They hadn't. They had ignored his report because patching it would have required taking the main executive servers offline for 12 hours, and Victoria Croft did not tolerate downtime. The terminal blinked. Connection established. Jason was in. He bypassed the front-facing financial systems. Those would be scrubbed clean, sanitized for the board of directors and the SEC. Instead, he dove into the internal communications, the messy, informal exchanges between department heads. He looked for anomalies. He looked for fear. Corporate empires like Croft Industries didn't collapse from the outside. They imploded because of the rot holding up the foundation. Victoria ruled by terror. When you rule by terror, your subordinates lie to you. They hide failures. They fudge numbers to avoid your wrath. Jason began pulling server logs, searching for keywords in the internal legal and compliance folders. Redact, delay, overrun, structural, hazard. Hours bled away. The lukewarm tap water in his glass tasted like copper. The glow of the screen etched deep lines onto his face. At 3:14 a.m., he found it. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a thread. A massive discrepancy in the materials procurement logs for the Jewel, Croft Industries' upcoming flagship luxury residential skyscraper in Dubai. The project was Victoria's crown jewel, the heavily leveraged anchor of her company's valuation. According to the official filings, they were using a proprietary, ultra-durable steel alloy required by local engineering codes for seismic stability. But according to a buried email chain between the lead project manager and the chief financial officer, an email chain marked urgent/off record, The supplier had gone bankrupt months ago. To maintain the construction schedule and hide the disaster from investors, Croft had quietly substituted a cheaper, substandard steel from a shadow corporation. The building, currently 60 stories high and climbing, was structurally compromised. Victoria knew. The CFO had explicitly told her in a heavily encrypted memo that Jason managed to decrypt using a legacy key left active on a backup server. Her response was a single line: "Pour the concrete. Bury it. We go public next quarter." Jason sat back, the cheap folding chair creaking under his weight. He stared at the screen, his heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against his ribs. She was building a glass coffin in the desert, risking thousands of lives purely to protect her stock price. Jason downloaded the entire cache of emails, the forged procurement receipts, the suppressed engineering reports. He encrypted the files, copying them to 3 separate physical flash drives. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt a heavy, terrifying burden settling onto his shoulders. He possessed the match that could detonate a multi-billion-dollar empire. He closed the laptop. The sun was just beginning to bruise the horizon, casting a pale, sickly light through the kitchen blinds. Jason walked to the sink, splashed cold water on his face, and looked in the mirror. He looked exactly the same. Just a tired man with sawdust on his boots. But Victoria Croft was about to find out exactly how much damage a discarded rounding error could do. Victoria Croft sat at the head of a 20-foot mahogany conference table, nursing a cup of black espresso. The room smelled of expensive leather, floor wax, and fear. It was 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. The weekly executive alignment meeting. 10 men and women, each pulling down high 6-figure salaries, sat rigidly in their ergonomic chairs, practically sweating through their silk blouses and custom dress shirts. "The Q3 projections are a fantasy, David," Victoria said softly, not looking up from the tablet resting on the table. She swiped to the next page. The microscopic sound of her finger against the glass made the chief marketing officer flinch. "I asked for growth, not a creative writing exercise. Are you lying to me, or are you just incompetent?" "Victoria, the Asian markets have been sluggish," David started, his voice tightening. "Sluggish is an excuse for the weak," she snapped, finally raising her slate-grey eyes. "Fix it, or I will find someone who can." She took a sip of her espresso. It was bitter, exactly how she liked it. She felt invincible. The IPO for the Jewel project was 6 weeks away. When the bell rang on Wall Street, her net worth would double. The minor annoyances of her life, incompetent executives, pathetic contractors tracking dirt into her lobby, were microscopic specks of dust in her rearview mirror. Her phone buzzed against the wood. Victoria ignored it. She never looked at her phone during meetings. It was a power play. It buzzed again and again. A continuous, vibrating spasm. Irritated, she glanced at the screen. It was an incoming call from Richard Vance. Her stomach gave a rare, involuntary twitch. Richard was the managing partner of Vanguard Capital. He was her largest private backer, holding a 20% equity stake in Croft Industries. He didn't call during business hours unless someone was dead or something was burning. She held up a finger, silencing David mid-sentence. The room held its breath. She tapped the screen and brought the phone to her ear. "Richard, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Her tone was instantly smooth, accommodating. "Victoria," Richard's voice was hollow, stripped of its usual patrician warmth. "Are you alone?" "I'm in a board meeting. I can step out if—" "Cancel the meeting. Go to your private office, now." Victoria's jaw tightened. No one spoke to her that way. But Richard held the purse strings. She stood up abruptly. "We are adjourned. Get out," she said to the room. The executives scrambled to their feet, practically fleeing for the heavy oak doors. She walked into her private suite, the thick carpet muffling her footsteps. She locked the door behind her. "I'm alone. What is it?" "Check your personal encrypted email inbox, the one you use for our off-the-books communications." Victoria walked to her desk, tapping the trackpad on her secure terminal. She logged in. There was a single new email, no subject line. The sender address was a string of random, masked characters. "I see it," she said. "Open the attachment. Tell me if I'm looking at a forgery." She clicked the PDF. It was the memo, the encrypted memo from her CFO, detailing the substandard steel being used in the Jewel project. Right there, blaring on the screen, was her own response. "Pour the concrete. Bury it. We go public next quarter." The air in the room suddenly felt dangerously thin. Victoria's lungs seized. The scent of her bergamot perfume turned cloying, sickening. "Richard," she managed to say, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, "this is an elaborate fabrication. Someone is trying to shake us down." "Don't lie to me, Victoria," Richard hissed, the venom bleeding through the phone speaker. "The sender didn't ask for money. They CC'd me, the primary investor. They also attached 72 pages of procurement logs, banking transfers to the Shadow Corp, and internal engineering warnings. My forensic team spent the last 3 hours verifying the digital signatures. They're real." "Who sent it?" she demanded, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of her mahogany desk. "I don't know," Richard said coldly, "but they included a message at the bottom of the email." Victoria scrolled down past the damning evidence. At the very bottom, in plain, unformatted text, were 2 sentences. "You treat people like they are nothing. Let's see what nothing can do." "Victoria," Richard's voice was grim. "If the SEC sees this, or God forbid, the media Vanguard Capital will pull our funding immediately. I will personally initiate a hostile takeover and drag you through federal court for fraud. Who did you piss off?" "No one," she lied, her mind racing through the thousands of lives she had ruined, the careers she had ended, the competitors she had crushed. The list was endless. She was a woman who burned bridges for warmth. It could be anyone. "Find them," Richard ordered. "Fix this. You have 48 hours before I am legally obligated to notify my board, at which point I am cutting you loose." The line went dead. Victoria stood in the silence of her immaculate office. The view from her window showed the sprawling metropolis, millions of people looking like ants. For the first time in 10 years, her hands were shaking. She wasn't angry, she was terrified. Someone was inside the walls of her fortress. Jason sat at a crowded diner across town, watching Leo eat a plate of greasy scrambled eggs. The diner smelled of burnt toast and old fryer oil. It was the best meal they'd had in a week, paid for with the last $20 in Jason's wallet. His phone sat face down on the sticky Formica table. He took a sip of his black coffee. He didn't feel the adrenaline rush he expected. He just felt an immense, quiet resolve. The first domino had fallen. He knew Vanguard Capital's protocols. They wouldn't go to the police immediately. They would panic. They would squeeze Victoria, and they would try to contain the blast. They were going to make her bleed before they killed her. "Dad?" Leo asked, his mouth half full of toast. "Are you okay? You look weird." Jason blinked, the hardness in his eyes softening as he looked at his son. He reached across the table, wiping a crumb from Leo's chin. "I'm fine, buddy. I just figured out a really complicated problem at work." "Did you get the money from that mean lady?" Jason's gaze drifted to the window, looking out at the smog-choked city skyline. Somewhere up there, in a glass tower. Victoria Croft was suffocating in her own hubris. "No," Jason said softly, picking up his coffee cup. "But she's going to pay us back, every single cent." Fear has a specific metallic scent. It smells like stale breath, sour stomach acid, and the ozone tang of overworked servers. By midnight on Wednesday, the executive floor of Croft Industries reeked of it. Victoria sat in the center of her office, the lights dimmed to a solitary desk lamp. The sweeping view of the city felt less like a conquered kingdom and more like a grid of thousands of eyes staring back at her. Her ivory blazer hung over the back of a chair, wrinkled. She had kicked off her heels hours ago. The thick carpet scratched against her bare soles as she paced. A heavy knock rattled the frosted glass of her door. "In," she commanded, her voice ragged. David, the head of corporate security, stepped into the room. He was a broad, deeply pragmatic man who rarely spoke above a murmur. Right now, his tie was loosened, and a sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He carried a thick, leather-bound tablet. "Tell me you found the leak," Victoria said, stopping her pacing. She crossed her arms, digging her manicured nails into her own biceps to stop her hands from trembling. "We traced the digital footprint," David said, his voice flat. He didn't offer a comforting preamble. He knew better. The breach didn't come from a current employee. It was an external routing protocol. Someone used a legacy contractor credential to bypass the firewall during the system migration last month. They piggybacked on an old Active Directory token that IT forgot to purge. Victoria's stomach dropped. A contractor? Yes. David tapped the screen of his tablet and set it on her desk. "We pulled the access logs. The credential belongs to a third-party vendor who installed the upper-floor networking arrays. He had sweeping temporary privileges to map the servers." Victoria stepped toward the desk, leaning over the glowing screen. A digital dossier stared back at her. A low-resolution ID photo of a man in his late 30s. Faded flannel shirt. Tired eyes. Deep grooves framing a mouth set in a permanent line of exhaustion. Jason Hayes, systems architect. She stared at the face. She stared at the name. Nothing. The file meant absolutely nothing to her. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I don't know this man. I have never spoken to this man. Why would a random cable puller have Vanguard Capital's private routing addresses? Why would he care about the Jewel project?" David shifted his weight. "Ms. Croft, he was in the building 3 days ago. Security cameras show him in the main lobby. There was an incident." "What incident?" "He was here with a child. There was a spill. You revoked his invoice and had him escorted out." Victoria blinked. She searched her memory, sifting through a blur of quarterly reports, hostile takeovers, and endless meetings. A puddle of water, a crying child. The memory materialized, thin and insignificant. She had squashed a bug on her way to an elevator. That was all it had been, a moment of necessary discipline for someone who had disrespected her space. That was him, she asked, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The absolute absurdity of it choked her. That pathetic creature in the dirt. He did this? "He had the keys to the kingdom, Victoria," David said grimly. "And you took $10,000 from a man who clearly had nothing left to lose. He didn't just steal the steel procurement logs. He downloaded the architectural redundancy files. He has everything. Arrest him." She slammed her hand on the desk. "Call the police. Call the FBI. I want him in handcuffs before sunrise." "We can't," David replied, not flinching. "If we involve federal authorities, the stolen data becomes part of discovery. The SEC will subpoena the files to verify his motive. You'll be handing them the very fraud you're trying to hide. We have to handle this internally." Victoria stared at the tablet, the face of Jason Hayes mocking her with its unremarkable mediocrity. Let's see what nothing can do. Across the city, in a cramped apartment that smelled of old grease and cheap laundry detergent, Jason sat on the floor of his tiny living room. The TV was on, muted, casting a flickering blue light across the worn carpet. He held a cordless power drill in his right hand. Between his knees sat the hard drive from his laptop, completely removed from its casing. His hands were shaking. A cold sweat dripped down the back of his neck, soaking the collar of his shirt. This wasn't a movie. He wasn't a stoic hacker watching code cascade down a screen. He was a father terrified that a SWAT team was about to kick his door off its hinges and drag him away from his sleeping son. He positioned the drill bit over the silver platter of the hard drive. He squeezed the trigger. The high-pitched whine of the drill biting into metal set his teeth on edge. Tiny, sharp shavings of aluminum sprayed across his jeans. He drilled 3 holes straight through the drive, shattering the platters inside, ensuring the data could never be recovered by any forensic team on Earth. The smell of hot metal filled the room. Jason dropped the drill. He leaned back against the cheap fabric of the sofa, dragging a trembling hand down his face. He dry-heaved once, his stomach twisting into violent knots. He had covered his digital tracks. He had routed the Vanguard email through a proxy server in Estonia, bouncing it through 3 different encrypted VPNs. But Croft Industries had endless resources. They would find him eventually. It was just a matter of time. He looked toward the cracked door of Leo's bedroom. The boy had cried in his sleep tonight, a soft, broken whimpering that tore at Jason's chest. Try being a man who can actually afford to raise a son. Jason picked up a cheap prepaid burner phone from the coffee table. He had bought it with cash at a gas station 2 miles away. He didn't want Victoria Croft's money anymore. Money wouldn't fix the humiliation she had stamped onto his son's memory. She needed to understand what it felt like to be entirely powerless. He opened a text message draft, typing in a phone number he had memorized from the stolen executive files. Thursday morning arrived with a suffocating, humid heat that clamped down on the city. Victoria had slept for 45 minutes on the leather sofa in her office. Her mouth tasted like ash. Her phone vibrated on the glass coffee table. She snatched it up. It was Richard. "You have 24 hours left," the investor said. No greeting, just the ticking clock. "Have you contained the breach?" "We know who it is," Victoria lied, smoothing her wrinkled trousers. "A disgruntled contractor. We are executing a quiet retrieval of the data today. It's under control." "It better be," Richard snapped. "Because if a single page of that structural report hits the press, I am freezing Croft Industries' credit lines. I won't go down for your negligence, Victoria." He hung up. Victoria threw the phone onto the sofa. She walked to her private bathroom, gripping the edges of the marble sink. She stared at her reflection. There were dark, bruised hollows under her eyes. The immaculate, untouchable CEO was cracking. Before she could splash cold water on her face, her office phone rang. The direct, secure line. She walked back to her desk and picked up the receiver. "What?" "Check the local construction union's public forum." David's voice was tense, tightly coiled. "Right now." Victoria grabbed her tablet, her fingers clumsy as she navigated to the site. It was a primitive, text-based message board used by the heavy machinery operators and steelworkers. Pinned to the top of the forum, posted anonymously 10 minutes ago, was a single, low-resolution photograph. It was a screenshot of a Croft Industries invoice. The invoice clearly showed the purchase of the substandard Shadow Corp steel, cross-referenced with the delivery address of the Jewel project. Beneath the photo was a caption. "Are you pouring concrete over a grave? Ask Croft what you're really building." Victoria felt the blood drain from her head. The room spun, tilting dangerously. "They're walking off the job," David said through the phone. "The union rep just called the site manager. They're demanding an independent structural inspection before they pour another yard of concrete." "Victoria, if the inspectors get on that site, it's over." "No," she gasped, her chest tight. "No, pay them. Bribe the union rep. Whatever he wants. Double their hourly rate." "It's not about money," David replied. "They think the building is going to collapse while they're working on it. They're terrified." And the local news stations just picked up the forum post. A reporter from Channel 8 is already parked outside the site. Jason hadn't gone to the police. He hadn't gone to the SEC. He had gone to the people whose lives were actually at risk. He was dismantling her from the ground up, severing the physical labor that built her empire. "Fire the CFO," Victoria blurted out, her mind scrambling for a sacrifice. "Draft a press release. Say we discovered unauthorized material substitutions made by rogue financial officers. We're launching an internal investigation and halting construction voluntarily to ensure safety." "Victoria, you signed the off-record emails approving it." "They don't know that yet," she screamed, her voice shattering the quiet of the office. "The union doesn't have the emails. They only have the invoice. Fire him. Throw him to the wolves. Buy me time." She slammed the phone down. Her chest heaved. She was suffocating. The invincible architecture of her life was collapsing inward, the structural integrity failing, just like the cheap steel in her tower. Down in the city, Jason stood at a bus stop, holding Leo's hand. The boy was wearing his backpack, ready for school. Jason's burner phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, shielding the screen from the glare of the morning sun. It was an alert he had set up to track Croft Industries' stock ticker. The market had opened 20 minutes ago. Croft Industries was already down 9%. The news of the Jewel project halting construction had spooked the algorithms. Millions of dollars in valuation were evaporating by the second. "Dad," Leo tugged on his sleeve. "The bus is coming." Jason looked down at his son. He saw the scuffed toes of Leo's sneakers. He remembered the 3 drops of water on Victoria's suede shoes. "I see it, buddy," Jason said softly. He didn't feel joy. He didn't feel the catharsis he thought revenge would bring. He just felt a hollow, relentless momentum. He had thrown a wrench into the gears of a massive machine, and now he could only watch as it tore itself to pieces. He watched Leo climb onto the yellow school bus. The doors hissed shut. Jason turned away, walking down the cracked sidewalk. He took the burner phone, dialed Victoria Croft's direct office line, a number strictly reserved for board members and family, and pressed call. He walked as it rang. On the 4th ring, a breathless, panicked voice answered. "Who is this?" Jason stopped walking. He listened to the ambient silence of her office through the receiver. He could hear her ragged breathing. "It's the rounding error," Jason said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. Flat, dead, a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Hayes," Victoria's voice shook. The icy venom was gone, replaced by raw, naked panic. "Listen to me, whatever you want. I will wire $5 million to an offshore account right now. You take your kid, you disappear, and we end this." Jason closed his eyes. $5 million. It was a phantom number, a number that could fix his entire life, buy Leo a house with a yard, pay for college, erase the crushing weight of poverty forever. He gripped the phone tighter. "I wanted $10,000, Jason said softly. "I wanted an apology for my son, but you told me to try being a man who could afford to raise him." "I was wrong," she begged. the word sounding foreign, sharp as glass in her mouth. "I'm sorry. I am so sorry, please." "You're not sorry, Victoria," Jason replied, opening his eyes. He watched a piece of trash blow across the street. "You're just cornered. Tomorrow morning, Vanguard Capital gets the rest of the emails. Have a good day." He hung up. He popped the back off the burner phone, removed the battery, and dropped both pieces into a storm drain. He listened to them splash into the dark water below. There was no going back now. The empire was going to burn, and he was going to stand in the ashes. Regret didn't hit Jason all at once. It seeped into his bones, slowly, like damp cold through a thin jacket. Jason stood in his narrow kitchen, staring into the open refrigerator. The harsh yellow bulb illuminated a tragic inventory. A half-empty jar of generic mayonnaise, a plastic carton of milk that expired yesterday, and 3 shriveled apples. $5 million. He gripped the edge of the refrigerator door. The plastic cracked faintly under his knuckles. $5 million. It was a phantom sum, a number so large it didn't feel real, yet it had been floating in the air between his ear and the phone speaker just an hour ago. He could have taken it. He could have swallowed his pride, accepted the blood money, and changed Leo's life forever. A house with a backyard, a college fund, a life where pink eviction notices didn't exist. Instead, he had chosen vengeance. He had prioritized his own bruised ego, his own desperate need to see Victoria Croft bleed, over his son's financial security. Jason closed the fridge. The magnetic seal shut with a wet, pathetic smack. He sank to the cracked linoleum floor, pulling his knees to his chest. The kitchen faucet dripped. Plink, plink. Every drop sounded like a gavel striking wood. He buried his face in his rough, calloused hands and let out a dry, ragged sob. He wasn't a hero. He was just a bitter, broken man who had let anger steer the wheel. But as he sat in the dark, the memory of Leo kneeling in that puddle of water flared behind his eyelids. The absolute disgust on Victoria's face. She would have paid the $5 million, yes, but she would have spent the rest of her life believing Jason was exactly what she called him, a stray dog begging for scraps. She wouldn't have been sorry. She just would have been annoyed at the price of the bribe. Jason wiped his face with the back of his flannel sleeve. The guilt was suffocating, but the resolve beneath it had hardened into iron. He pulled himself up off the floor. Across the city, the atmosphere inside Croft Industries was toxic. The air conditioning on the executive floor was running at full blast, but Victoria felt like she was suffocating in a sauna. "You can't do this, Victoria," Gregory, her chief financial officer, said. His voice was a reedy, panicked squeak. He paced in front of her desk, his expensive silk tie hanging crookedly from his unbuttoned collar. "You cannot issue a press release blaming me for the steel substitution. I won't let you." "You don't have a choice," Victoria snapped, leaning over her desk. Her hair, usually sprayed into an immaculate, unmoving helmet, was fraying at the edges. A stray lock hung in her eyes. "The union is on strike. The local news is running with the story. The stock is down 14% since lunch. I need a severed head to hold up to the cameras, Gregory, and yours is the only one that fits the block." "I was following your direct orders," Gregory yelled, his face flushing a dangerous, mottled purple. "I told you the supplier went bankrupt. I told you the substitute alloy failed the seismic shear tests. You told me to pour the concrete. Show me the proof," she challenged, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. She stepped around the desk, advancing on him until he bumped into the leather sofa. "Show me a single piece of paper with my signature authorizing the substitution." "You can't, because it doesn't exist." Gregory stared at her, his chest heaving. The sheer sociopathic ease with which she was willing to destroy his life paralyzed him. "The emails," he stammered, "the off-record servers, are entirely encrypted and currently being scrubbed by David's security team," Victoria lied flawlessly. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her face remained a mask of absolute disdain. "By midnight, there won't be a single byte of data connecting me to that decision. It will be your word against a billionaire's. Who do you think the SEC is going to believe?" She watched the hope drain completely from Gregory's eyes. He sagged, suddenly looking 10 years older. "Clear out your desk," Victoria ordered, turning her back on him. "Security will escort you out in 5 minutes. If you speak to the press, I will have my legal team freeze your assets before you finish the interview." She heard the heavy oak door open and click shut. Victoria braced her hands against the window frame, looking out at the city. Her reflection stared back at her, pale, hollowed out, entirely alone. She had bought herself 24 hours. If she could stabilize the stock price tomorrow, if she could appease Richard and Vanguard Capital, she could survive this. She picked up her phone. No new messages. She had offered him $5 million. He had hung up. That kind of irrationality terrified her more than any corporate raider or federal investigator. People who wanted money could be managed. People who wanted blood could not be bargained with. Friday morning smelled of impending rain and cold coffee. The sky over the city was a bruised, heavy grey, threatening to crack open at any moment. Jason sat at his wobbly dining table, his laptop open. The screen glowed harshly against the dim morning light filtering through the cheap plastic blinds. It was 8:55 a.m. The stock market opened in 5 minutes. Leo was sitting on the carpet behind him, watching a cartoon on the muted television. Jason had 3 email drafts open. The first was addressed to Richard at Vanguard Capital. The second was addressed to the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The third was addressed to the tip line of the New York Times financial desk. Attached to all 3 emails was a zip file containing 72 pages of internal Croft Industries communications, unredacted accounting ledgers, and the damning unencrypted email thread between Victoria and her CFO. Jason stared at the cursor blinking in the send box. His finger hovered over the trackpad. His stomach churned, a sour, acidic rolling that made him lightheaded. This was the point of no return. Once he clicked this button, Victoria Croft was finished. But so was his anonymity. The authorities would eventually trace the emails back to the burner IP addresses. They would find him. He might face charges for corporate espionage. Try being a man who can actually afford to raise a son. Jason looked back at Leo. The boy was laughing silently at the cartoon, his small shoulders shaking. Jason's jaw tightened. He turned back to the screen. He didn't hesitate this time. He clicked send 3 times. The physical action was microscopic, a millimeter of plastic depressing under his fingertip. But the devastation it unleashed was nuclear. Jason closed the laptop. The fan whirred down, plunging the kitchen into a heavy, expectant silence. 50 blocks away, Victoria stepped out of her private elevator and into the cavernous Italian marble lobby of Croft Industries. She wore a charcoal grey pantsuit, tailored to act as armor. She had spent 2 hours in a makeup chair, having the dark circles under her eyes painted over, her skin airbrushed into a mask of aggressive vitality. She was on her way to a press conference outside the building to publicly throw Gregory to the wolves and announce a proactive safety audit of the Jewel project. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm against the stone. But as she neared the revolving doors, she noticed the lobby was too quiet. The usual hum of interns, executives, and receptionists was missing. Instead, a cluster of people stood near the security desk, frozen. Victoria slowed her pace. "David!" she called out, looking for her head of security. David stepped out from behind a massive marble pillar. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the floor. The heavy glass revolving doors hissed open. 7 men and women walked into the lobby. They didn't wear expensive suits. They wore cheap, off-the-rack windbreakers with 3 yellow letters printed on the back. FBI. Flanking them were 2 agents from the SEC, carrying empty cardboard banker's boxes. Victoria stopped dead. The metallic scent of ozone and floor wax suddenly nauseated her. A tall man with a greying moustache stepped forward, holding up a folded piece of paper. "Victoria Croft?" She didn't answer. Her slate-grey eyes darted to David. "Stop them," she whispered, a desperate, irrational command. David shook his head slowly. "It's over, Victoria. The emails leaked to the Times 10 minutes ago. Vanguard Capital just publicly divested from the company. The stock is in freefall. They halted trading." "That's a lie," she said, her voice cracking. The armor was fracturing. The makeup suddenly felt heavy, suffocating her pores. "It's a fabrication." The lead agent stepped into her personal space. He didn't blink. He didn't care about her bespoke suit or the fact that her name was stamped in silver letters above the reception desk. "Ms. Croft, we have a federal warrant to seize all servers, hard drives, and physical records in this building. You are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, and reckless endangerment." "You can't arrest me in my own lobby," she spat, taking a step backward. Her heel slipped on the polished marble, the exact spot where Jason had knelt 3 days ago. She stumbled, catching herself awkwardly against a chrome stanchion. The absolute indignity of the stumble shattered the remaining silence in the room. Several employees pulled out their phones, the camera lenses staring at her like unblinking mechanical eyes. "Turn around, Ms. Croft. Place your hands behind your back," the agent instructed, his tone bored. "Do you know who I am?" she hissed, genuine hysteria bleeding into her voice. "I employ half this city. I built this skyline." "Hands behind your back," the agent repeated, grabbing her wrist. The cold, heavy bite of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists sent a shockwave through her nervous system. It was a visceral metallic click that echoed off the high ceilings. She was being physically restrained, stripped of her agency, stripped of her power. As the agents marched her toward the revolving doors, the local press, originally gathered for her scapegoat speech, swarmed the glass. Camera flashes erupted in a blinding strobe light assault. Microphones were shoved toward her face. Victoria looked down at the floor, trying to hide her face from the cameras. She saw the marble sliding beneath her feet. She remembered the 3 drops of water. She remembered the tired contractor in the frayed flannel shirt. She had crushed a bug, and the bug had brought down the entire house. Back in the apartment, Jason sat on the edge of his bed, watching the tiny, static-filled television. The news anchor's voice was tense with excitement. The screen showed live helicopter footage of Victoria Croft, her hands bound behind her back, being shoved into the back seat of an unmarked federal sedan. Her hair was messy. Her face was pale, caught in the harsh glare of a camera flash. She looked incredibly small. Jason stared at the screen. He waited for the rush of triumph. He waited for the vindication to wash over him, to make the hunger in his stomach and the late rent notices disappear. It didn't come. There was no soaring music. There was no magical check arriving in the mail. Victoria Croft's life was ruined, her empire was burning, and Jason was still exactly where he was yesterday. The only difference was a hollow, exhausted emptiness settling in his chest. "Dad," Jason turned. Leo was standing in the doorway, clutching a battered stuffed bear. "Is that the mean lady?" Leo asked, pointing at the television. Jason looked at his son, then back at the screen as the federal sedan drove away, swallowed by the city traffic. He picked up the remote and pressed the power button. The screen popped, shrinking into a tiny white dot before fading into black glass. "Yeah, buddy," Jason said softly, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. He held out his arms. That was her. Leo climbed onto the bed, burying his face in Jason's chest. Jason wrapped his arms tightly around his son, burying his nose in the boy's hair, breathing in the scent of cheap shampoo and innocence. He had burned down a billionaire's life to defend this child's dignity. It didn't pay the rent. It didn't put food in the fridge. But as Jason held his son in the quiet, dim apartment, he realized something else. He didn't feel like a stray dog anymore. Cardboard possesses a dry, dusty odor when you fold it into moving boxes. It smells like displacement. Jason dragged a roll of cheap packing tape across the seam of a medium-sized box. The harsh, ripping sound of the adhesive echoed in the nearly empty living room. It was Tuesday, 4 days after Victoria Croft was shoved into the back of a federal sedan on live television. Revenge, Jason had learned, did not pay rent. The pink eviction notice had matured into a physical lockout order. The landlord, a faceless management company, didn't care that Jason had single-handedly exposed the largest corporate fraud of the decade. They only cared that his ledger showed a balance of negative $1,200. "Put your comic books in the blue duffel bag, Leo," Jason said softly. He didn't look up from the tape. Leo was sitting cross-legged on his bare mattress, carefully stacking his worn paperbacks. The boy moved with a quiet, heartbreaking efficiency. He was too young to be this good at packing up his life. "Are we going to the place with the pool, Dad?" "No, buddy, a different one this time." Jason hoisted the taped box onto his shoulder. His lower back screamed in protest. They were moving into an extended-stay motel out by the interstate. It charged by the week and didn't run credit checks. It was a concrete box with a rattling wall-mounted air conditioner and a carpet that felt sticky no matter how many times it was vacuumed. He carried the box down the 2 flights of stairs and shoved it into the trunk of his rusted sedan. The sky above the parking lot was a brilliant, mocking blue. Jason leaned against the bumper, wiping a streak of sweat from his forehead. A heavy, sickening guilt settled in his gut. He had burned the world down to protect his pride, but his son was still sleeping in a place where sirens wailed every hour. He could have taken the $5 million. The thought returned, an intrusive parasite gnawing at his conscience. $5 million. He could be loading Leo into a luxury SUV right now, heading toward a house with a sprawling green lawn. Instead, he had chosen his dignity. And dignity, it turned out, meant sleeping on a motel mattress that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach. He slammed the trunk shut. The metallic clatter grounded him. No, he wouldn't trade his soul for her hush money. If he had taken the bribe, Victoria would still be pouring concrete over a grave. People would have died. He had to hold on to that. It was the only thing keeping him from fracturing completely. Across the city, a different kind of reality was settling into a much colder, much smaller room. Victoria sat at a bolted-down steel table inside the Metropolitan Detention Center. She was shivering. The air conditioning was piped in at a constant 65 degrees. She wore a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that felt like sandpaper against her skin. The fabric smelled fiercely of industrial detergent and old, trapped sweat. Her attorney, a heavily jowled man named Gibson, who charged $1,200 an hour, sat across from her. He looked exhausted. He had spent the last 96 hours trying to stop the bleeding, and he had failed. "Bail is denied," Gibson said, his voice flat, devoid of the deferential groveling Victoria was accustomed to. "The judge considers you an extreme flight risk. Your passports are seized, and the asset freeze is absolute. The DOJ has impounded everything down to your personal checking accounts." Victoria stared at the scarred metal of the table. A previous inmate had scratched the word "wait" deep into the steel. "I want Vanguard Capital to post a surety bond," she croaked. Her throat felt raw. She hadn't drank the tap water in her cell. She refused to touch it. Gibson sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Vanguard is gone, Victoria. Richard is cooperating with the SEC. He handed over every off-record email, every encrypted routing log. He claimed you built a rogue shadow infrastructure to deceive the board. He's claiming total victimhood." Victoria's head snapped up. Her slate-grey eyes, usually sharp enough to cut glass, were bloodshot and wide with genuine terror. "He knew! He authorized the Shadow Corporation." "He scrubbed his own fingerprints," Gibson countered bluntly. "And unfortunately, the whistleblower data leak only contained communications bearing your digital signature, your directives. You are holding the bag, all of it." A cold, heavy stone dropped into Victoria's stomach. The rounding error, the cable puller in the dirty boots. He hadn't just leaked everything. He had surgically curated the data to ensure the blast radius hit her dead center while leaving the investors just enough room to sever the limb and survive. "What are they offering?" she asked, the words tasting like copper on her tongue. "The U.S. attorney is offering a plea." Gibson opened a manila folder, sliding a single sheet of paper across the steel table. "Securities fraud, wire fraud, and criminal negligence. If you plead guilty and spare the state a trial, they'll recommend 12 years in a federal penitentiary." 12 years, she whispered. The air in the interrogation room suddenly vanished. The walls, painted a sterile, nauseating institutional green, seemed to bow inward. "I'll be nearly 60. If you fight it and lose, you will get 25. Minimum." Gibson leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "You have no leverage, Victoria. Your company is in receivership. Your assets are gone. Your friends are testifying against you. This is the bottom." She looked down at her hands. Her manicured nails were chipped, a jagged edge of pale polish exposing the raw nail beneath. The untouchable armor was gone. She was just a body in a room. Victoria closed her eyes, and for the first time since she was a child, she wept. It wasn't a dignified, cinematic crying. It was an ugly, gasping sob that echoed off the cinder-block walls, a desperate sound of a predator realizing it was locked in a cage it had built itself. Autumn arrived in the city, stripping the trees bare and turning the air sharp and biting. Jason sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room of a mid-sized logistics firm out in the industrial park. He wore a navy blue suit. It was off the rack, purchased from a discount department store, but it was clean, pressed, and it fit him perfectly. His knees didn't shake. His palms weren't sweating. The last 2 months in the motel had been brutal. They ate a lot of canned soup. They watched television on a screen the size of a toaster. But every night, when Jason turned off the lights, he didn't feel the crushing weight of humiliation pressing on his chest. He felt tired, yes, but he felt clean. "Jason Hayes?" A woman holding a clipboard smiled at him from a doorway. "Mr. Caldwell will see you now." Jason stood up, buttoned his jacket, and followed her down a hallway lined with grey cubicles. The office smelled of fresh toner and stale coffee. It was a painfully ordinary place, It wasn't a glass tower. It didn't have Italian marble floors. It was just a business that moved freight from point A to point B. He stepped into a modest office. A man in his 50s with rolled-up sleeves and a tired smile stood up, extending a hand. "Jason, thanks for coming in. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Caldwell." They shook hands. The grip was firm, equal. They sat down. Caldwell flipped open Jason's resume, tapping a pen against the paper. "Your background is impressive. Senior architect at Sentinel Tech, lead auditor for regional banks. But there's a gap here. 6 months doing independent contract work. What happened?" Jason looked at the man. He didn't look away. "My wife got sick. Cancer. I had to step away from a demanding corporate schedule to care for her, and then to care for our son after she passed. The contract work gave me the flexibility I needed to be a father first." Caldwell's eyes softened slightly. The corporate mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second, revealing the human underneath. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Jason." "Thank you." Caldwell looked back at the resume. "One of these recent contracts, Croft Industries. You did the upper floor server integration for their new headquarters?" Jason didn't flinch. "I did." "I read about the collapse," Caldwell said, his tone turning cautious, probing. "The whole company went into liquidation. Feds raided the place over that skyscraper in Dubai. It was a mess." "It was," Jason agreed evenly. "I was only there for a brief window. I mapped their infrastructure and identified several critical security vulnerabilities. They chose to ignore my report." Caldwell let out a dry, appreciative chuckle. "Management usually does. Well, we don't build skyscrapers, Jason. We track shipping containers. Our servers aren't pretty, but they need to be unbreakable. I need someone who actually looks at the foundation, not just the paint on the walls." "I specialize in foundations," Jason said. Caldwell closed the folder. "Starting salary is $85,000, full health benefits, dental, and we don't do all-nighters here. You leave at 5 to get your kid. Does that work for you?" Jason felt a sudden, intense pressure behind his eyes. It wasn't the $5 million he had been offered. It wouldn't buy a mansion, but it would buy a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood. It would buy fresh groceries. It would buy peace. "That works perfectly," Jason said, his voice remarkably steady. 4 hours later, Jason pushed a shopping cart down the brightly lit aisle of a grocery store. The wheels squeaked faintly. Beside him, Leo was bundled in a brand-new, thick winter coat. It wasn't corduroy, and the cuffs didn't ride up past his wrists. It fit him perfectly. Jason tossed a bag of crisp, expensive apples into the cart, then a carton of organic milk, then a thick cut of flank steak. "Can we get the dinosaur oatmeal?" Leo asked, pointing a small, mitten-clad hand toward the top shelf. Jason looked at the overpriced, sugary box of oatmeal. He smiled, reaching up and pulling 2 boxes down, tossing them into the cart. "Grab the maple syrup flavor too." The sensory weight of the grocery store, the smell of the bakery, the hum of the freezer aisles, the vibrant colors of the produce section, felt overwhelmingly beautiful. It was the architecture of a normal life, restored. That same afternoon, a heavy iron door clanged shut in a federal penitentiary upstate. Victoria Croft stood in the center of her cell. It measured 8 feet by 10 feet. A narrow window, crisscrossed with steel bars, let in a pale, weak slice of autumn sunlight. Her cellmate, a woman serving 10 years for embezzlement, was asleep on the top bunk, facing the concrete wall. Victoria walked to the small stainless steel sink in the corner. She turned the knob. The water sputtered out, cold and harsh, smelling faintly of chlorine. She cupped her hands, letting the water pool in her palms. She brought it to her face, splashing the cold liquid over her skin. As she pulled her hands away, a few drops missed the basin. They fell, hitting the scuffed linoleum floor with a hollow, pathetic thwack. 3 drops of water. Victoria stared down at the small puddle near the toe of her canvas prison-issue slip-ons. There was no one to yell at. There was no security to call. There was no power left to wield. She bent down slowly, her knees popping in the quiet cell, and wiped the water off the floor with the sleeve of her own jumpsuit. Power isn't about the money you hoard. It's about the people you step on to get it. Jason didn't need $1 billion to win. He just needed to remind a tyrant that every skyscraper sits on a foundation built by the people she ignored. If this story of brutal karma and quiet dignity hit home for you, smash that like button right now. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into revenge, justice, and survival. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the $5 million? Or did Jason make the right choice? Share this video with a friend who loves a true underdog victory.